My name is Sarah Carter, and if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be telling strangers the story of my life, the heartbreak, the betrayal, and eventually, my triumph, I would have laughed. I was young then, full of hope and dreams, believing that love was the most powerful force in the world. Thank you so much for listening, truly. It means the world to me that you're here, and if you enjoy this story, please subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments what country you're listening from. I hope it touches you, and I hope it helps you feel less alone. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. My childhood was simple, filled with laughter, summer picnics, and the comfort of a family that loved me deeply. But even then, I was different. I had a wild streak of independence, a yearning to see the world beyond the mountains and rivers that surrounded my home. I wanted excitement, passion, a life worth remembering. That desire led me to Ethan Miller, a man I met at a photography exhibit in Portland. Ethan was magnetic, tall, with dark hair that always seemed slightly tousled, and eyes that could pierce through the strongest of walls. When he spoke, it was with a quiet authority that made everyone listen, and when he smiled, it felt as though the universe had paused just for me. I fell for him instantly, perhaps too quickly, swept away by the intensity of our connection. At first, everything was perfect. Ethan was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted. He told me I was the most beautiful woman he had ever met, that he wanted to build a life with me, a future full of love and shared dreams. I believed him with all my heart. We moved in together within months, and soon after, we were married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by family and a few close friends. I thought I had found my safe place, the home where I would finally belong. But the truth, as I would come to learn, was far darker. Ethan's love had a shadow, a side of him that he hid from the world, a side that only I was privileged enough to see. It started small, a sharp remark here, a critical glance there. He would make offhand comments about my appearance, my work, my family, always delivered in a tone that seemed almost casual, but which cut me to the bone. I brushed it off at first, telling myself that I was overreacting. I thought maybe I was too sensitive, too emotional. But the pattern grew, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Ethan began isolating me from my friends and family, making me feel guilty for wanting to spend time with anyone else. He controlled the finances, scrutinized my every purchase, and questioned my decisions as though I were incapable of thought. Every argument ended with me apologizing, even when I had done nothing wrong. I remember one night vividly. I had planned a small dinner for my parents, who were visiting from out of state. I spent hours preparing, choosing the right wine, making my mother's favorite dish. When they arrived, Ethan was nowhere to be seen. Later, he appeared, furious that I had distracted myself with family instead of giving him my full attention. He criticized everything, the food, the table setting, even the way I smiled at my mother. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling small, insignificant, and trapped. But even in my despair, I discovered something unexpected, a tiny spark of resilience. I began keeping a journal, a secret record of everything, every insult, every moment of control, every instance where I felt my voice being silenced. In those pages, I found clarity. I started to see the patterns, to understand that this was not my fault, that his cruelty said more about him than it did about me. I also began noticing small cracks in his armor. Ethan was brilliant at presenting a perfect image to the world, but he was reckless with his trust. I observed his habits, his weaknesses, and slowly, quietly, I began plotting, not out of revenge at first, but as a way to reclaim my sense of self. Every insult he threw, every attempt to undermine me, only strengthened my determination. I realized that patience was my weapon. And so, I endured. I smiled when I wanted to scream. I nodded when I wanted to argue. I played the role of the obedient, loving wife while secretly building a life that he could never touch. I went back to school in secret, taking night classes to earn a degree in counseling, something I had always dreamed of pursuing. I saved money in secret accounts, quietly investing in a future where I would be free. It wasn't easy. There were nights when despair threatened to swallow me whole, when I questioned whether I had the strength to continue. But every morning, I reminded myself of one simple truth: I was not powerless. I had a mind, a heart, and a fire inside me that even Ethan could not extinguish. Slowly, I began to see the world through a new lens. I noticed how his control over me was never total. There were cracks, tiny opportunities where he let his guard down, moments when his arrogance blinded him. I learned to walk carefully around him, to use his overconfidence to my advantage. I started reaching out to old friends in secret, reconnecting with people who reminded me of the woman I used to be. At work, I began taking on projects that Ethan had discouraged me from pursuing. I smiled and nodded when he tried to manipulate me into quitting, and I quietly excelled behind his back. Every small victory strengthened me, built my confidence, and fueled my plan. I realized that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about reclaiming power, bit by bit, until one day, I could take my life back completely. Even as the fear and pain lingered, I felt a growing sense of freedom within me. Ethan may have thought he could control every part of my world, but he underestimated my resilience. The more he tried to break me, the more I learned about myself, about the strength hidden behind my quiet obedience. And now, as I look back on those early days of my struggle, I see that patience wasn't just a coping mechanism, it was the foundation of my victory. Each insult, each humiliation, each attempt to diminish me only made me sharper, wiser, and more determined. I realized that the real battle wasn't with him, it was with my own fear. I am Sarah Carter, and this is the story of my pain, my patience, and my ultimate triumph. I endured, I planned, and I waited for the perfect moment to reclaim everything that was mine. And I promise you, dear listener, the story is just beginning. It had been nearly a year since my life with Ethan began to feel like a carefully constructed prison. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Our house was immaculate, our social appearances flawless, and our friends and colleagues saw nothing but a loving, successful couple. But behind closed doors, the truth was far more complicated. Every morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach, bracing myself for Ethan's criticisms. Some days were worse than others. He would find fault with the way I dressed, the way I spoke, even the way I looked at him. I learned quickly that outward compliance was the only way to avoid a day full of tension, yet inwardly, I refused to let him break me. I started noticing patterns in his behavior, subtle cues that revealed his insecurities. Ethan thrived on control, but he feared exposure. He was a man obsessed with appearances, desperate to hide any flaw in the image he projected. I began to study him the way one might study a puzzle, observing his reactions, his triggers, and the moments when he let his arrogance cloud his judgment. I found solace in the small things I could control. I returned to my love of painting, setting up a small studio in the corner of our sunroom. No one visited me there. Ethan, in particular, never paid attention, believing my hobbies to be trivial. But each brushstroke became a declaration of independence, a reminder that some parts of me remained untouchable. Even more importantly, I rebuilt my network of friends. Ethan had tried to isolate me, creating rifts between me and the people I loved. Slowly, discreetly, I reached out to old friends and colleagues. I arranged secret coffee meetings, reconnected through emails, and even began volunteering at a local women's shelter. The work was fulfilling, and the connections reminded me of the life I deserved, a life beyond Ethan's shadow. Money had always been one of Ethan's weapons. He controlled every account, scrutinized every purchase, and justified it as practicality. But I found ways to regain a measure of independence. Using small amounts from my own work and discreet savings, I opened a hidden account and began investing in a secure, anonymous way. Every deposit felt like a small victory, a step toward freedom I knew I could not yet declare. One evening, Ethan was particularly cruel. We had friends over for dinner, and I had spent hours preparing a meal I was proud of. Yet, he found every opportunity to belittle my efforts. "Did you even try, Sarah?" he sneered, his words cutting sharper than any knife. I forced a smile, silently counting my victories in my head. Every insult he threw now fueled my determination rather than broke my spirit. I started to realize that the power dynamic between us was not as one-sided as he believed. Every secret I kept, every quiet plan I made, was a thread weaving a new reality, one in which I would no longer be at his mercy. I began jotting ideas for my escape, not a reckless flight, but a carefully constructed strategy that would ensure I reclaimed my life without chaos or danger. At night, I would sit alone in our bedroom, writing in my journal by the dim light of the lamp. I recorded every slight, every insult, every manipulation, and I catalogued them meticulously. It became a roadmap, not for revenge, but for justice. I wanted to prove to myself, and to anyone else who might doubt me, that endurance, patience, and cleverness could dismantle even the most oppressive control. Some nights, I allowed myself to dream of freedom. I imagined living alone in a small loft in Portland, painting, writing, and finally breathing without fear. I imagined reconnecting with my family fully, speaking my mind without hesitation, and building a life that reflected my true self, not the shadow of a man who sought to dominate me. Through all of this, I remained outwardly compliant. To the world, I was the perfect wife, attentive, cheerful, and seemingly devoted. Ethan's friends and colleagues admired our apparent harmony, unaware of the emotional battles waged behind closed doors. It was exhausting, but I embraced the exhaustion because it meant my plan was working. He believed he had control, but he didn't. I remember a particular afternoon, sitting in the sunroom while Ethan was out. I spread my paintings across the floor, each canvas a fragment of my heart, my unspoken rebellion. As I stepped back, I realized that these small acts of independence, these private victories, were building something larger. I was learning to trust myself again, to acknowledge my worth, and to reclaim the parts of me he had tried to erase. It was also during this time that I discovered the first real crack in Ethan's armor. He had become careless with his secrets, leaving emails open, muttering about investments, and underestimating my attention to detail. I saw opportunities forming, like windows and walls that had seemed impenetrable. Each observation, each note I took, became part of a strategy, a future where I could finally stand without fear. Even as I plotted, I felt a deep sadness. I mourned the life I had imagined, the love I had once believed in. But sadness was no longer a chain, it was a fuel. It reminded me that I had survived, that I had grown stronger in the crucible of cruelty. Every insult, every manipulation, had shaped a resilience in me that no one could take away. The days blurred into months, each one reinforcing a quiet strength. I had learned to navigate Ethan's moods, to anticipate his outbursts, and to turn his arrogance into an advantage. My independence grew in ways he could never detect, and with it, my confidence. I realized that patience was not passive, it was active, deliberate, and powerful. As the first year of the secret journey drew to a close, I finally allowed myself a small smile. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but I also knew something crucial: I was no longer helpless. Ethan's control had limits, and within those limits, I had found freedom, strategy, and strength. And though I could not yet speak my victory aloud, I felt it growing inside me, like a seed preparing to blossom. Every brushstroke, every note in my journal, every small act of defiance was a step toward reclaiming my life, and I would not stop until I had it all back. I never thought courage could feel like this, quiet, persistent, almost invisible. It wasn't the bold, cinematic bravery that movies make it out to be. It was subtle, internal, the kind that builds slowly until it becomes unstoppable. I had spent months observing Ethan, cataloguing his habits, and quietly reclaiming my independence. But now, the time had come to test the boundaries I had built. Ethan remained oblivious to the transformation happening right under his nose. To him, I was still the obedient, loving wife who never questioned him, who smiled when he was pleased, and who kept her frustrations hidden. But the truth was, every day I grew stronger, more confident, and more aware of his weaknesses. One Friday evening, I invited an old friend, Lydia, over for tea. Lydia had been a constant in my life before Ethan's manipulation had forced me into isolation. She was clever, witty, and perceptive, the kind of friend who sees the truth in your eyes even when you try to hide it. I needed someone outside of Ethan's influence, someone who reminded me that my life wasn't limited to his world. As we sipped our tea, I felt a sense of normalcy I hadn't experienced in months. I laughed freely, without the careful monitoring that Ethan's presence had always imposed. Lydia noticed it immediately. "Sarah," she said gently, "you're different. Stronger. I see it in your eyes." Her words made my heart swell. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was hiding behind a mask. But reality was never far away. Just as we were finishing our tea, Ethan returned unexpectedly, earlier than he had said he would. His presence was like a shadow falling over the room. I felt the old tension creeping in, the familiar knot in my stomach, but this time it didn't dominate me. I met his gaze calmly, smiling politely, and continued our conversation as if nothing were amiss. Ethan's scrutiny was sharp. "Who's here?" he asked, voice measured but with an undercurrent of suspicion. I introduced Lydia, noting Ethan's subtle narrowing of his eyes, his body tensing as if he were preparing for a confrontation. But I remained composed. "Lydia and I were just catching up," I said smoothly, feeling a thrill of quiet triumph. He could see the interaction, yes, but he couldn't touch the strength it took to smile while plotting my freedom. That evening, as Lydia left, I felt a surge of empowerment. If Ethan had been watching, he hadn't understood the significance of that small gathering. It was more than just tea with a friend. It was proof that I could reclaim parts of my life without his knowledge. It was my first conscious, unguarded act of rebellion, and it tasted sweeter than anything I had imagined. Over the next few weeks, I continued to push these boundaries subtly. I enrolled in a workshop for women entrepreneurs, something Ethan had discouraged. I started attending a local book club, joining discussions and debates with confidence I hadn't felt in years. Each step felt dangerous, exhilarating, and necessary. I was testing the waters, proving to myself that my life could exist outside Ethan's control. Money remained a central tool in my plan. Every time Ethan criticized a purchase, I stored away a portion of my income in secret accounts. Slowly, methodically, I built a safety net. It wasn't enough to escape immediately, but it was enough to dream of a future where I could walk away without fear. Financial independence was the foundation of my eventual liberation, and I guarded it like a precious secret. One night, after a particularly harsh argument with Ethan, I retreated to my studio. I spread my journal and notes across the table, reviewing every detail I had recorded. His patterns were predictable: anger, arrogance, subtle manipulation, but he underestimated my patience and intelligence. I realized that I didn't need to confront him yet. The time for confrontation would come later, and when it did, I would be ready. I also discovered a small vulnerability in Ethan's work habits. He often left sensitive documents on his desk, thinking I wouldn't notice. I began photographing and cataloging these details, creating an evidence trail that would protect me if ever he tried to undermine me legally or socially. It was tedious and nerve-wracking, but it felt empowering. I was no longer a victim. I was preparing to reclaim control. Even as I planned, I faced moments of doubt and fear. Late at night, I would lie awake, questioning whether I was strong enough to follow through. But each time, I reminded myself that fear was temporary, and freedom was forever. Every small act of courage, every hidden step toward independence, was proof that I could survive and thrive beyond his reach. By the end of the month, I began to notice small shifts in Ethan's behavior. He was more irritable, more suspicious, and increasingly careless. His overconfidence was blinding him to my growth, and I intended to use that to my advantage. I was learning the delicate art of patience and timing, the knowledge that the perfect moment to reclaim my life would come, and I had to be ready. As I prepared for another week of careful maneuvers, I felt a sense of calm determination. I was no longer merely surviving, I was thriving within the constraints he imposed. Every secret meeting, every discreet plan, every act of quiet rebellion was a thread weaving the fabric of my liberation. And though the path ahead was fraught with danger, uncertainty, and emotional turmoil, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would not allow Ethan to define my life any longer. The seeds of freedom had been planted, nurtured in silence, and soon, they would bloom into a reality that he could neither predict nor prevent. The first step toward true freedom is always the hardest. I had spent months quietly reclaiming pieces of myself, reconnecting with friends, investing in secret accounts, and quietly observing Ethan's weaknesses. But survival alone was no longer enough. I needed to act, to take deliberate steps that would tilt the balance of power in my favor. It started with a simple dinner. Ethan had a habit of inviting clients over to showcase our perfect home and marriage. He assumed I would always play the part of the attentive, smiling wife. But I had other plans. I prepared the meal meticulously, just as I had countless times before. Only this time, I introduced subtle changes. I made sure to highlight my own accomplishments in conversation, gently steering discussions toward my art, my volunteer work, and the entrepreneurial ideas I had been secretly developing. Ethan's charm had always been enough to dominate social situations, but this evening, I watched with satisfaction as he struggled to maintain control of the narrative. One of his colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman named Miranda, noticed my confidence immediately. "Sarah, these projects sound incredible," as she said, her voice genuine. Ethan's smile faltered, and I saw the tiniest flicker of unease in his eyes. For the first time, the veneer of his dominance cracked in front of others. It was intoxicating. After the dinner, I retreated to my private sanctuary, my studio, where I could breathe freely and plan my next moves. I spread my journal across the table, reviewing every note, every observation. Ethan had been careless lately, financial documents left unsecured, meetings scheduled without his usual caution, and personal information he assumed I couldn't access. Each misstep was a thread I could pull, a pathway toward reclaiming my life. I knew I couldn't act recklessly. Revenge, I realized, was not about immediate gratification. It was about strategy, precision, and timing. I began constructing a plan that would allow me to step out of his control permanently, legally, and without risking my safety. I documented everything meticulously: instances of manipulation, financial irregularities, emotional abuse, and subtle threats. This evidence was my shield, my proof that I was not the weak, submissive wife Ethan believed I was. The psychological tension in our home began to shift. Ethan, sensing perhaps subconsciously that I was changing, grew irritable, more controlling, yet increasingly careless. He underestimated me, as all abusers do, believing that patience and manipulation alone could hold me in place. But I had learned to turn patience into a weapon. Every day I endured, every insult I survived, every secret plan I implemented brought me closer to liberation. One night, I made my first deliberate move. Ethan had a habit of reviewing contracts for his business late at night, leaving documents unattended on the dining table. I quietly took photos of key papers, carefully noting details that could prove his recklessness and protect me should he ever attempt to manipulate finances or blame me for decisions. Each photo, each note, felt like a small strike against the control he had wielded for so long. I also reached out to Lydia and another trusted friend, Caroline, discussing subtle strategies and gathering advice on legal protections. I realized that isolation had been my greatest weakness, and by reconnecting with these women, I was building a support network strong enough to counter Ethan's influence. Emotional strength, I found, was as crucial as strategic planning. Some nights, I would lie awake, reflecting on how far I had come. I was no longer the terrified woman who cried alone in our bedroom. I was someone who could observe, calculate, and act with purpose. Each day, my confidence grew, and with it, the inevitability of change. Ethan's control began to falter in ways I hadn't dared hope for. He became increasingly suspicious, questioning minor details and reacting with unexpected anger to situations he previously ignored. It was a delicate balance. Too much defiance could trigger his wrath, too little and my progress stalled. I learned to walk the line with precision, striking when he was off guard, retreating when necessary, always keeping my long-term goal in sight. The first strike was small but significant. I had taken control of information, rebuilt connections, and subtly challenged his dominance in front of others. It was a psychological shift that Ethan could feel but couldn't quite name. He didn't understand that the woman he had thought fragile and submissive had been quietly cultivating power, patience, and strategy all along. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear. I knew this was only the beginning. The path ahead was dangerous and uncertain, filled with emotional turbulence and potential confrontation. But for the first time in years, I felt hope, the knowledge that I had begun to reclaim my life and that nothing could stop the momentum I had built. I was Sarah Carter, and the quiet endurance that had carried me this far was about to turn into deliberate action. The walls Ethan had built around me were no longer impenetrable. With patience, careful strategy, and unwavering resolve, I was finally beginning to break free. The air in our home felt different now. Tension had settled over every room, like a storm waiting to break. Ethan didn't realize it yet, but the balance of power had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Every smile I forced, every nod I offered, was a calculated part of a larger plan. And for the first time, I felt like the one truly in control. It had been months since I first began quietly reclaiming my independence, building my secret savings, reconnecting with friends, and observing Ethan's weaknesses. Now, I was ready to escalate. Small victories had taught me patience, but the time had come for bold action. I started with his professional life. Ethan had always been meticulous about controlling appearances, but he underestimated my attention to detail. I began compiling discrepancies I had noticed in his business dealings, cross-referencing them with financial records I had secretly accessed. Each error, each careless oversight, was another piece of leverage I could use, not for revenge yet, but for protection and security. At the same time, I became more assertive in our social life. We attended a charity gala together, and I allowed myself to speak freely, engaging with influential people in ways I never would have dared before. Ethan noticed the attention I received, the admiration, and for the first time, I saw something like insecurity flash in his eyes. It was subtle, but I recognized it immediately. That small moment of imbalance thrilled me. It meant my efforts were working. I also began to assert boundaries in our home. Ethan had long dictated every aspect of my life, from what I wore to who I interacted with. I started saying no in small ways, refusing to attend events that drained me, declining discussions that sought to belittle my decisions. Each refusal was a quiet rebellion, a declaration that my life was mine to control. Of course, these actions didn't come without consequences. Ethan became suspicious, his questions sharper, his tone more cutting. He tried to unsettle me, to draw me back into fear. But I was ready. I met his scrutiny with calm confidence, refusing to be intimidated. The old fear that had ruled my life for years had been replaced by strategy and resolve. One night, I made a decisive move. I scheduled a secret meeting with a trusted attorney, someone experienced in domestic and financial matters. My hands shook slightly as I recounted the months of manipulation and control, but I spoke clearly and confidently. This step wasn't about revenge. It was about securing my independence and protecting myself from any retaliation Ethan might attempt. I remember driving home afterward, feeling a mix of exhilaration and fear. The road ahead was dangerous, and I knew that any misstep could provoke Ethan's wrath. But I also knew that the days of silent suffering were over. I was no longer waiting for change. I was creating it. Back at home, I continued to build my support network. Lydia and Caroline became more involved, offering guidance, moral support, and practical advice. With their help, I began organizing documents, planning contingencies, and preparing a timeline for the moment when I would finally step out from Ethan's shadow. Every interaction with Ethan became a test. I observed his reactions closely, noting how he underestimated me, how his arrogance blinded him to the changes unfolding in his household. I realized that the key to liberation was patience coupled with calculated audacity. I could wait, bide my time, and act decisively when the opportunity presented itself. Emotionally, I felt stronger than I had in years. The fear that had once kept me silent was replaced with clarity and determination. I knew what I wanted, and I knew I had the strength, intelligence, and strategy to achieve it. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a life entirely my own, a life without Ethan's control, without manipulation, and without fear. I also began small, deliberate acts of defiance that would signal the coming change. I took control of the household schedule, asserting independence in decisions about finances, social engagements, and family interactions. Each small act chipped away at Ethan's illusion of dominance, creating a subtle yet undeniable shift in the power dynamic. By the end of this chapter in my life, I realized something profound. Patience alone had brought me this far, but action was necessary to complete the journey. I had endured, observed, and planned, and now it was time to take deliberate steps that would ensure my freedom. Every secret meeting, every calculated move, every small act of rebellion was part of a larger strategy, a strategy that would soon reach its climax. I was Sarah Carter, and for the first time in years, I felt unstoppable. The storm of tension around me was not a warning. It was a sign that change was imminent. Ethan's control, built over years of manipulation, was cracking, and the future I had envisioned in secret was finally within reach. The months of careful planning, patience, and subtle rebellion had brought me to this moment. Every small victory, every secret account, every quiet act of defiance had been a step toward reclaiming my life. Now, the stakes were higher, and the moves I made would have irreversible consequences. Ethan had grown increasingly unpredictable. He sensed the shift in the household but couldn't pinpoint its source. His arrogance blinded him to the reality. The woman he had sought to dominate was no longer afraid. I could see the cracks in his confidence, the tremor in his voice when he realized I wasn't following his every command. I began with financial independence. The accounts I had quietly accumulated over months were now fully under my control. I reviewed my investments, ensured all documentation was legally secure, and set up transfers that would allow me to step away completely if necessary. Money had once been his tool to control me, but now it was my weapon. Next came social reclamation. I invited friends and allies to gatherings, carefully orchestrating situations that showcased my independence and confidence. At one dinner, Ethan attempted to belittle my contributions in front of guests, but I calmly corrected him, explaining my projects and successes with poise and clarity. The shift in power was evident. He faltered, and the room noticed. For the first time, others saw him as flawed, while I stood strong. I also prepared for legal protection. Meetings with my attorney had clarified every possible risk and contingency. I had evidence of emotional manipulation, financial recklessness, and controlling behavior. This wasn't revenge. It was preparation to safeguard my future. Knowledge was power, and I intended to wield it decisively. One evening, I confronted Ethan directly in a way I had never dared before. I spoke calmly, but with authority. Ethan, this isn't working anymore. The control you think you have? It's gone. I have my life, my resources, and my support. I won't be silenced, manipulated, or dominated. The look on his face was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear. He realized, finally, that the woman he had underestimated for years was no longer under his influence. I could see the panic in his eyes, a recognition that the game had changed, and that he was no longer in control. Over the next days, I executed the final moves of my strategy. I finalized financial arrangements, solidified my support network, and prepared my exit plan. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and irreversible. I wasn't acting impulsively. I was ensuring that my liberation was complete and protected. Emotionally, I felt a surge of empowerment. Years of fear, isolation, and manipulation had forged a strength within me that I had never known. Every act of courage, every boundary I set, and every calculated risk had brought me closer to this moment. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist, a survivor, and a victor. The final confrontation came on a quiet evening. Ethan, frustrated and desperate, tried one last attempt at intimidation. I met him calmly, explaining my decisions, my independence, and the consequences of his actions. For the first time, he could not sway me, could not intimidate me, and could not manipulate me. I had reclaimed my voice, my autonomy, and my life. As I stood there, I realized the truth I had discovered months ago. Freedom isn't given, it's taken. It requires patience, courage, intelligence, and unrelenting determination. Every struggle, every moment of fear, had led me here, to a place where I was no longer controlled, no longer silenced, and no longer afraid. I was Sarah Carter, and the woman who had endured years of manipulation and cruelty had finally emerged victorious. Ethan's control was gone, and my life, finally, was mine. The storm had passed, leaving a clear sky and the promise of a future filled with strength, independence, and hope. The house was quiet now. The tension that had once filled every corner, every room, had finally dissipated. Ethan's shadow no longer loomed over my life. For the first time in years, I breathed freely, without fear, without hesitation, without the suffocating weight of control. The journey had been long, filled with fear, manipulation, and moments of deep despair. I had endured insults, isolation, and emotional cruelty, but each challenge had forged a strength within me I had never known existed. Every moment of suffering had been a stepping stone toward the freedom I now embraced. I sat in my studio, surrounded by the paintings that had been my sanctuary, my journals that had been my confidants, and the evidence of my careful planning that had protected me. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving. The first thing I did was reconnect fully with my friends and family. Lydia and Caroline became part of my life in a new, deeper way. We laughed, we shared stories, and we celebrated the victories that had once seemed impossible. The isolation Ethan had imposed was gone, replaced by a vibrant network of support and love. Financial independence brought a sense of security I had never known. The accounts I had quietly built, the investments I had carefully nurtured, and the resources I had secured gave me not just freedom, but peace of mind. I could make choices without fear, pursue dreams without restriction, and live life fully on my terms. Emotionally, I healed in ways that surprised me. The fear that had once dominated me had been replaced with resilience, confidence, and clarity. I had learned to trust myself, to honor my instincts, and to believe in my own worth. Each day, I felt stronger, more grounded, and more alive. Ethan's influence was gone, but the lessons remained. I understood now that patience, strategy, and careful observation were powerful tools. I had endured, planned, and acted deliberately, and that combination had allowed me to reclaim everything that was mine. I began new projects, painting exhibitions, volunteer work, and community initiatives that reflected my passions and values. I traveled, explored, and embraced life fully, no longer constrained by fear or control. Every choice I made was a celebration of independence, a declaration that I was finally living for myself. Sometimes, I still thought of Ethan, not with anger, but with clarity. The man who had once dominated my world was now just a memory, a cautionary tale of the power of patience, resilience, and self-belief. I had not only survived him, I had emerged stronger, wiser, and victorious. As I watched the sunset one evening, I felt a deep sense of peace. The storm was over, the shadows lifted, and the sky was clear. I was Sarah Carter, and my life was finally mine. The journey had been painful, but it had transformed me. I was free, I was strong, and I was unstoppable. Freedom was not just a word, it was a reality I had fought for, patiently, strategically, and courageously. And now, standing in the light of my own strength, I could finally say, I had endured. I had reclaimed my life. I had triumphed.